Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. As you can see, we're going to finish up our lecture regarding creating Mexican Americans. Now, we left off talking about the fight in California and how Anglo-Americans used the legal system, vigilantism, etc., to wrestle control of the land and power, authority, political power in California away from Mexicanos. Now we're going to move to New Mexico and talk about their fight for statehood, as well as the second-class status that was imputed upon Mexicanos. Now, I know what you're thinking. Who really cares about New Mexico? And to be fair, you would be remiss to think that New Mexico should have been much easier for Mexicanos, because why would Anglo-Americans ever really want to go there? But remember, there's a lot going on here. Number one is the idea of popular sovereignty. You need people to go there to vote for or against slavery. In addition, remember, one of President Polk's goals in the Mexican-American War was to build a railroad across the South from the east to connect to the Pacific Ocean. And so when the railroad arrives into New Mexico, it brings increased integration into the national markets and a flood of Anglos. This wave of Anglos will create a very interesting dynamic between Native Americans, Mexicanos, and Anglos, who are each seeking their own power and autonomy. But what makes New Mexico so interesting is not just the events that parallel elsewhere in the Southwest, but that in New Mexico, the Anglo colonists find themselves needing Mexicanos in their attempt at statehood. Because according to US law, if a territory wants to become a state, they need a certain number of voting eligible free whites. And because New Mexico was more sparsely populated, there weren't as many Anglos rushing there as, say, California, it was going to take a lot longer to get Anglo-Americans to have enough of them to form their own government and apply for statehood. They needed Mexicanos in that number, unlike places like California, which theoretically should give Mexicanos more power. But then secondly, what makes New Mexico so interesting is what happens in New Mexico is a form of what I would call imperialism or colonization, where they actually make New Mexico, they treat New Mexico like a colony, much like the United States will use as a pattern to treat Puerto Rico and the Philippines after the Spanish-American War in 1898. So New Mexico becomes kind of a test case of how we will colonize other nations. In other words, as the theorist Antonio Gramsci notes, quote, "Once the military violence ends, conquest does not cease, but instead enters a new stage," unquote. So the Mexican-American War is over, but that does not mean the conquest of land, conquest of culture, conquest of space is done. This is a new phase of it. So that's what I want to focus on today with this part of the lecture in New Mexico, is understanding how, with a numerically small number of Anglos, they're able to take control of the region. And so the territory, the territory of New Mexico was dominated by land-owning Mexicano elites who had a delicate balance of power and trade with Native Americans, specifically the Pueblo Indians. However, while the Anglo citizens would come into the territory like they do in California and Texas, the lack of immediate economic prospects, gold in California, cotton in Texas, causes numerically fewer Anglos to enter the territory. And thus, when they do seek admission for statehood, they have a much more difficult time securing the minimum required number of free voting whites. as early as 1866. So again, this is right after the Civil War, but as early as 1866, they formed a constitutional convention to try to apply for statehood ultimately. But the convention adjourned without taking action because not enough people showed up in Santa Fe. This is 1866. On your screen, you see a newspaper when they will finally get statehood in 1912. It's going to be 50 years of this process because of this delicate balance in the issue that not enough Anglos go there. So how do you colonize this area and take control of it with the numerically few Anglos? Now, of course, the issue here is how do you use Mexicanos to your advantage without giving them equality? And in 1890, there would be another vote for a state constitution that would once again be rejected on a 2-to-1 vote. And the reasons for that is outlined in the quote on your screen that says, the reasons that keep New Mexico from being a state that are put forward. So in other words, the reasons that they reject state constitutions are that, number one, they're primarily Hispanic. They're Roman Catholic. They don't speak English. They're poorly educated. These 4 things keep coming up over and over and over. Probably would have been issues if the people and their leaders had been united in their desire to push in becoming a state. And this is written by historian Rick Hendricks. Again, he's looking back on it. Why did it take 50 years for New Mexico to become a state? They had enough people who were eligible white voters if you count Mexicanos as free white voters. In other words, if Anglos in New Mexico had wanted to become a state really badly, they needed the Hispanos, who they were Tejanos in California, Tejanos in Texas, Californios in California. They were Hispanos in New Mexico. So the Mexicanos. If Anglos had really desired, if the number one priority was to make New Mexico a state, they needed the Hispanos to be white, which they were by law according to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. But they couldn't accept them as white socially and culturally. They didn't want to give them that equality. And therefore, they refused to become a state out of spite, out of not wanting Mexicanos to become equals. Or again, they're viewing the Mexicano population as second-class citizens. Let historian Laura Gomez say it. She says, quote, by the late 19th century, the New Mexico racial hierarchy consisted of 4 strata. White Euro-Americans at the top, Anglos, Mexican Americans below them, then the Pueblo Indians, and then other Indians at the very bottom. So they actually had 4 strata there. I have 3 on the screen. The Mexicans' collective naturalization in 1848 promoted a legal definition as Mexicans as white. But tensions around Mexican Americans' racial status arose because this legal whiteness contradicted the social definition of Mexicans as non-white. As a result, Mexican Americans came to occupy a position in the American racial hierarchy that was between white and non-white. Unquote. In other words, they're off-white. Because in the American society, it's a strict dichotomy. There's white, there's black. You're either white or you're black. And while legally Mexicans were white, the reality is they were put in a position here in the middle, between white and non-white. They're off-white, a new ethno-racial category. Legally white, useful for statehood purposes, but socially, culturally, economically non-white or other. Now, Mexicanos understood this. They tried to use this to their own benefit and advantage. For example, given the fragility that was Mexican American claim to whiteness, Mexicano elites often would pit themselves against African Americans. They would try to distance themselves against African Americans. They would actually adopt American racism against both African Americans and Native Americans as a way to distance themselves. Say, no, no, we're like you as white people, as Anglos. We are white also. We're not like those lower classes of African Americans and Indians. So they adopted the American forms of racism by claiming whiteness, seeking to distance themselves from other non-white groups. They would even do so by showing that, hey, we are enslaving people too. Now, there were not a large number of African Americans in New Mexico. It was mostly Indians to deal with. And so Mexicanos began to actually enslave Native American populations as a way to claim that they're white too. But ultimately doesn't help much. Anglos would have to prove to the rest of the country that New Mexico was worthy of full membership in the American political system, i.e., become a state. Principally, though, Anglos had to demonstrate that the social order in New Mexico had been established. That New Mexicans, especially the Hispano and Indian population, could be transformed into proper Americans. It's one thing to say Mexicanos were white and to say, well, we have our 60,000 white people needed for statehood. But that wasn't good enough for the rest of America, who viewed the Mexicanos as substandard, as second class. And the result of that was they had to basically whiten New Mexico. In order to do this, Anglos entered into New Mexico and sought to transform it into their own image, that as an image of whiteness. This would involve a complete and total makeover of the land, the language, the culture, and the courts. In other words, Anglos come in and they want to remake it in their own image. To remake New Mexico into something that looks whiter, more American. And they did so by making over the land, the language, the culture, and the courts. Now, perhaps the easiest of this was the language and land issue. So the language is easy because, well, English becomes the accepted language. That was easy. It's a slow transition, but it's pretty easy. Land loss was also far easier in New Mexico than it was in California even. It is estimated that prior to Anglo arrival, prior to the Mexican-American War, that some 6,000 Mexicanos, which represent about 10% of the families, they lived on small land claims without proper titles, proper legal documentation. Because what happened was, under the old Spanish land grants, a lot of it was owned collectively as communal land or community land that had been awarded to these groups of families by either the Spanish or Mexican governments. This was a commonly accepted land use in the New Mexico territory, which again, modern day is both New Mexico and Arizona. It's a lot of desert land. And because that it's not fertile soil for growing crops, they would grant these communal land access or communal land grants where multiple families work the same land in order to make a go of it and survive. The problem is this was not recognized by Anglo-America. And as a result of these were not official land grants, the legal documentation, the way usual land grants are, it became easy for the US government, corporations, and even individual Anglo-Americans to enter in and steal the land. So again, because they don't have the proper documentation, because it's these communal land grants, this becomes far easier than it was in California even. So land and language are pretty easy. The courts are fairly easy because you just put people and appoint people to the courts that are like you. The big one, though, is the culture. How do you do and change the culture? How do you establish a quote unquote proper white culture, a proper white social order? This takes more work. And this begins when I say that process that will be utilized in future conquest following the Spanish-American War of 1898. And it starts with even newspaper depictions, cultural otherness. You see, let me give you an example of this. For example, in local newspapers, if you go back and read newspapers from New Mexico from the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, into the 1900s, you'll see that when Anglos hold celebrations like the 4th of July celebration, local newspapers laud these celebrations as being patriotic and a great display of Americanness and guns ablazing. Everyone's celebratory and happy. But when Native Americans or the Hispano population celebrated, say, the Dia de Seis, a Mexican holiday, the Anglo newspaper editors would denounce the celebration. They also say in the newspaper, oh yeah, that celebration happened, but they denounce them. They criticize them. They use derogatory terms in the depictions. They highlight and exacerbate, say, uncool acts like drunkenness or violence that occur during these events. Those same events, these same instances like drunkenness and fighting occur at 4th of July celebrations too. But the newspapers choose to ignore them at the Anglo events, the proper American events, but they highlight those bad parts of the Mexicano events. And one of the big ones became the drinking issue. You see, Anglo-New Mexicans, they drew upon these very stark distinctions that were common to broader America. Throughout the late 19th, early 20th century, sobriety and temperance, the American temperance movement, that was anti-drinking, became critical markers of proper whiteness. In other words, drinking alcohol was associated explicitly with racial and ethnic differences, otherness. And so, like when there's a rape case going on in New Mexico, the trials became public events. The courts would reinforce these actions and bodily practices that were deemed acceptable and normal. So this is how we should act in society. But those traits were always assigned to Anglos. But anything that was considered disreputable or suspect was assigned to the Hispano population, specifically the poor Hispanos. And these things included things like drinking, bar hopping, and or dressing in revealing clothing. In other words, you're a rape victim, it's probably your fault. Let me give you an example. When a young Mexicano girl would claim rape or sexual assault, she as the victim would be questioned about her role in the attack. Investigators would go out and question those who knew her, her friends, her family, those around her, to find out if she was a quote-unquote sexual deviant or loose, or someone who invited the attack based on her reputation. But on the flip side, if you look at court cases from New Mexico, if an Anglo woman accused an Hispano male, it was the Hispano male who was assumed to be guilty, and that she was the victim. And she would never be questioned about what she was wearing or what her sexual practices are, whether she was loose or a deviant, or was she a prostitute even. It didn't matter. The fact that she was an Anglo woman gave her respectability. And these sexual practices would support these racialization projects as these, especially these Mexicana women, they could expect extensive and humiliating testimony regarding their sexual reputations compared to Anglo women who would never be questioned. Because through the courts and through the newspapers and through sexual practices even, or drinking practices, they are trying to reinforce what proper white American culture looks like. Now, the group that took advantage of all of this was the Santa Fe Ring. So you see in your screen, proper practice, Anglo drinking is normal, but if you're a Mexicano and drink, it's just bad traits. It's inherently racist. And again, you see the newspaper clips on the screen. Mexicans use knives, stabbed 3 policemen, killed by dynamite. There was a fight last night. Again, there should not really be a distinction. Okay, a fight broke out. It happens every day. But you're choosing to specifically highlight these people were Mexican. Therefore, they apparently are, violent, and they are prone to violence, and they use weapons, and they are drunks, and they're sexual deviants. They're, if they're men, they assault Anglo women. If they're, Mexican women, they are, inviting the rape from the men. And this normalizes what they would consider white standards or whiteness standards. This is how a proper white person embodying whiteness and citizenship should act. They're trying to whiten the state. Now, the group that took advantage of all this is a group called the Santa Fe Ring. Now, the Santa Fe Ring was a group of men with ties to the military who were composed of merchants, lawyers, and swindlers. And they would make tremendous land gains from generation-old land titles. The Santa Fe Ring was the first and perhaps most notable political machine in New Mexico's history. It's a Republican-oriented group that will dominate the New Mexico territorial politics in the later 19th century. They will count among its ranks nearly every governor of the territory and most federal officials from 1865 to the late 1880s. The Santa Fe Ring recruits judges, lawyers, land surveyors, doctors, merchants, and they combine all their talents and specialties and forces for profit and political power. Through appointments to key territorial offices delivered by Republicans from Washington, D.C., with support of the local business class and the journalistic press, they succeeded brilliantly. Although they were located on the far frontier, the Santa Fe Ring reflected a cooperative, monopolistic, and had multiple enterprise tendencies. That was very rivaled, similar to the business practices of the Northeast after the Civil War, that we'll talk about later. This chief means of maintaining influence was to parlay land into economic clout by purchasing, inflating, repackaging, and marketing land grants that had once been doled out by Spanish rulers, taken by the U.S. government, given to the Santa Fe Ring. The most grandiose venture of the Santa Fe Ring was to steal the Maxwell land grant. That was 2 million acres. The leader of the ring, pictured on your screen, Thomas Benton Catron, he acquired more than 1 million acres of land for himself. Now, while there were a number of Hispanos that were part of the ring, hoping to gain some white acceptance, most find themselves outside of political power by the end of the century. And thus what happens here is they use the court system to swindle Mexicanos out of land because they have the judges, they have the lawyers, they have the politicians, and they rewrite the laws and they disregard the historic land grants promised to Mexicanos via the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And because they control every facet of the process here with lawyers, judges, politicians, they're able to take control of the land, even though this will delay statehood for them. For New Mexico, they didn't care as long as they were able to maintain power and build their own wealth, as Catron there has more than 1 million acres himself. They control the railroads, they control the economy, they control the land, they control the politics, they control the courts, and they control the press, which are pitting a direct distinction between, as I showed you a minute ago, between what is proper white living versus proper Mexican living. And this diametrically opposed idea that what whites are doing is normal and good and what's best, whatever the Mexicans are doing is inherently bad traits that was apparently given to them based on their ethno-racial birth. And if you thought this was bad, when we come back next time, things get much worse. But until then, take care and bye-bye.